Welcome to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the StrategyCorp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. As always, I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. Today, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Instead of launching season 4 of the podcast as expected, we're going to do a host of mini-series of podcast episodes about the federal election over the next few weeks. Today, it's August the 17th as we record this, and I'm joined by John Duffy. John is a well-known liberal strategist and co-founder of StrategyCorp and a principal, and therefore also one of my bosses. But aside from that, John's had an illustrious political career. It spanned all 3 levels of government. He served as a senior advisor to the Right Honourable Paul Martin, to Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne, and to Toronto Mayor John Tory. So experience at all levels of government. He's been active in party politics. He's helped write platforms and campaign documents, and he's also the author of Fights of Our Lives, Elections, Leaderships, and the Making of Canada, which is a best-selling examination of 5 pivotal elections in Canadian history, and it was named one of the top 5 political books of the last quarter century in Canada. So knowing that we had someone at the firm who literally written a book on elections, it seemed like a pretty good guy to have on to talk about this election in 2021. So John, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for joining me today.
A pleasure, Mitch.
So let's get right into it. The most obvious question for someone that has spent a lot of time reviewing the history of Canadian elections, how they work, what happened in them. You studied 5 in depth in your book, and given the timing of the 2021 election, the most pressing issues of the campaign, I'm kind of curious if there's a comparison campaign, if there's another election that comes to mind that's similar to this one or has any similar traits that you kind of expect that's going to happen in this election.
Well, when I wrote Fights of Our Lives 20 years ago, I had 3 criteria for what made a great national election that yielded the 5 campaigns that I studied. And, you needed to have a great fight, like a really fun match that was really compelling to the country. You needed to have a great national question in play, and you needed to have an evolution in the structure of how politics worked. We can't know yet if there is an evolution in the structure of how it works. That you can only figure out after that change either happened or didn't. As far as a compelling fight, we'll see if one happens. Although summer campaigns are often somewhat designed to be uncompelling by the actors who orchestrate them. So I wouldn't say it's likely to become one. And then the third thing is a great national question. Now, this is the interesting one, particularly for public policy practitioners and folks who listen to the podcast, Mitch, who I think are pretty sophisticated observers of public policy, and many of them are participants in the system. The Prime Minister pointed to this question of what the election's about quite directly when he compared the political situation to 1945. Which of course was the end of the Second World War, and the moment at which the King government went to the people with a package of social reforms that really amounted to the erection of the foundations of the Canadian welfare state. It was the 1945 election was the completion of business that had begun before the war to lay down the foundations of the social system in Canada, government-supported social systems. The war had interrupted that, and King, along with other governments, notably in Great Britain, took the occasion of the end of the war saying, okay, are we really going to do this stuff now? This is the stuff we needed to do to heal the social wounds of the Great Depression and to shore up the vulnerabilities in society that were revealed by the Great Depression from 1930, really until 1940. And then the war got in the way, but now we're really going to build back better. Does this sound familiar? So in those famous elections, in Canada, the Liberal government was returned with an impressive new array of social agenda items that they went about implementing through the remainder of the King government and through his successor, his handpicked successor, Louis Saint-Laurent. That was a successful operation. In Britain, something very different happened. In the 1945 election, Winston Churchill, who had just won the war against Hitler and saved civilization, ought to be a pretty good card at the ballot box, shockingly lost at the polls and was replaced by a very uncharismatic fellow named Clement Attlee, who was nonetheless a good politician. Because the people of Britain, the voters of Great Britain, believed that Churchill wasn't really planning on introducing those kinds of reforms, even though his government said they probably would, and that they could trust Clement Attlee and his Labour Party to actually deliver the social supports that Britons had come to believe were part of what they were fighting to secure by way of a better world at the end of the Second World War. So, two stories of 1945, both involving impressive agendas of social support, one that ends horribly for the incumbent, where Churchill was informed partway through the Potsdam Conference with Stalin and Roosevelt that he had to go home because he was no longer Prime Minister of Great Britain. He had been following the election, but still one of the most shocking episodes in history. Stalin couldn't believe what was going on. He was like, "What do you mean you're not the Prime Minister? You're Winston Churchill. We don't have these problems in Soviet Russia." Anyway, one that ended terribly for the incumbent, but it involved society in the UK. Another which went off like a charm for the Liberal incumbent, Mackenzie King. So Trudeau is advancing the thesis that what the policy subject of this election is a wide-ranging package of social supports, at the centerpiece of which is early learning and childcare on a national scale, that will substantially fill out the Canadian social framework. And that these changes, which have been implemented and introduced in an expansionary way during the COVID crisis, that actually address things like income inequality and social mobility and inclusion in the middle class, that this package represents the step forward in our social progress that COVID kind of got in the way of, but now we can build back better. So he's saying that's a big thing that this election is about. Interestingly enough, just a day or two ago, Erin O'Toole actually really contested that territory with the release of the Conservative Party platform, which said, we don't want to have early learning and childcare delivered by government actors in the provinces and not-for-profits. We want to give money to parents in the form of tax cuts, tax credits, stuff you'd know about better than I do, Mitch, that would enable them to go and shop the market and get the childcare that they need on an individually procured basis. So in effect, you do have a pretty large question of how Canada's going to move forward on the table. Is it as historic as the free trade debates of 1988? Maybe not. Is it as significant as the policy disputes in 1957 and 1958? Yeah, it is actually. So I think we're going to have to see, and that's why we have the campaigns, to see really what they do amount to.
Right. So in the book, I think you call them nation-shaking questions, and it's interesting in thinking about this election through that lens, because I think when we were sort of coming up with some questions for this podcast and we were thinking about that, we wrote down, obviously, one being, what is the ballot question going to be? Is it going to be how the government managed the pandemic? Is it going to be looking at how they approach rising house prices? Is it general economic health? Is it fighting climate change? And if you look back 2-3 months ago, before the childcare announcement, probably wouldn't have been one of the questions on your radar. Now you're saying it's probably one of the pivotal questions that's going to come up in this election. So is that the ballot question that the Liberals want fought on? Is it the ballot question that the other parties want, or are they trying to push a different ballot question for the people of Canada to make a decision?
I think the Liberals are framing a stay the course ballot question. Do you want to or don't you? And I think the Trudeau version of the Liberal Party has been pretty good at cementing its ballot question in the public mind. In 2015, which I think probably was a great campaign. First of all, it was such a shocking result. A party goes from third to first, never happened before at the national level. And it deposed a very strongly entrenched prime minister. What the Liberals were really running on was saying, Canada's changed and the Conservative government hasn't changed with it. So if you think Canada actually is a place of acceptance of LGBTQ realities, if you think Canada is actually a place where it's legal to smoke, where it ought to be illegal to smoke pot because kind of everybody does it, so who cares? If you think Canada is a place that shouldn't be hanging out with people like George Bush and should be hanging out with people like Emmanuel Macron and other more sort of forward-looking leaders, Canada's already like that. You need a government that's actually like that. Let's get rid of this government, which isn't like that. And I think and of course, an equity agenda at the heart of it in substantive terms. I think the Liberals were able to set that course, deliver substantially on that course, and move ahead with it. And climate change and addressing climate change was obviously in the center of that idea of what Canada's about and what we're doing here, that the Liberals were able to put in front of the public, and the public said, yeah, that's my Canada. In a lot of ways, Liberals have been running Choose Your Canada campaigns ever since the creation of the modern Conservative Party by Prime Minister Harper when he was opposition leader and leader of the Reform Party for a while, or the Canadian Alliance, arguing that the Conservative proposition in its contemporary form is actually not in the Canadian political tradition, that it's something kind of alien that's come from Montana or Texas or somewhere, but certainly not from here. And I think in the end, most Liberal ballot questions are a variant on that. And I think that will be the case in this campaign. I think a big addition to that will be the Liberals saying, and in addition to those markers of what is the normal Canadian position, you have to add an aggressive approach to vaccination. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be added to the list of things that Canadians do. And if you agree that that's the list, you vote Liberal. And if you don't agree that's the list, you might want to vote Conservative. The Conservatives, for their part, I think, want to frame the election as being about the economic choice. And, to say to Canadians, do you really trust the Liberal government, who appear to be a little uncaring about public finances, who may appear to be a little uncaring about the underpinnings of wealth and prosperity in the country, and who may appear to be pretty casual about throwing money around, taxpayer money at the end of the day, however financed? Do you trust these guys, or are they up to their old bad ways that kind of in your muscle memory, a lot of you Canadians know can get the country into a bad place? I think that's probably a reasonable version of what the Conservatives are trying to make the ballot question. They'll have some support in that because the New Democrats will be saying the same question, but with a different predicate. The question of can you trust Trudeau will be, is he actually sincerely progressive, or does he just talk a good game that way? And the Bloc will be saying Trudeau poses as a friend of Quebec, but can you trust him? And then the Green Party will be saying Prime Minister Trudeau poses as a foe of climate change and a friend of the planet, but again, can you trust him? So I think the Liberals will be saying, do you trust our course of action? Are you comfortable with it? Do you feel that's your Canada? And the other parties will all be saying different variances of, can you trust Justin Trudeau? I think that's kind of what the clash is going to look like.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because this is Trudeau's second election as the front runner, right? I mean, you could argue potentially it's the third, but to your point, they were in third place and turned it into first. So it's really hard to argue.
I could argue that, Mitch.
But so we'll leave it at two. But I mean, obviously that puts you on your record more so than anything else. So one thing that I'm most interested in when I think about what Prime Minister Trudeau has to do in this election is building the coalition across the country. Canada is not an easy place to campaign. There's 3 coasts, there's 2 official languages, there's lots of different regional alienation, some massively different economic priorities, have and have not provinces. We hear that language all the time. Previous prime ministers have done a great job of building a coalition across the country. Stephen Harper did it for the Conservatives. You've wrote about Wilfrid Laurier doing that back all the way in 1896. Trudeau had built that coalition across the country, lost a little bit of it in the second election that he fought. How does he get that back? And do you expect that he just focuses a lot of time in those few seats where that's the difference for him from minority to majority territory?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at the history of Canada's regional coalitions, and it is a regional history, geography being so important to the Canadian experience, What you see is probably the most frequently occurring coalition is one of the Prairie West allied with Quebec and Ontario, British Columbia on the outs, but the governing party would split with the opposition, Ontario, British Columbia, and the Maritimes. So to be kind of solid Quebec, solid prairies on the governing side, and bits and pieces of Ontario, British Columbia, and Atlantic Canada on the governing side. And that's enough to give you a majority. The alternative coalitions usually revolved around a more solid Ontario for the governing party and a more solid Maritime. So you'd sort of say you get a change of government when the Quebec Western Coalition is in disarray and the challenging party is able to put together enough solidity in the more fragmented parts of the country that don't vote as cohesively and take them over the top. But this game has changed because, for one thing, the emergence of the Bloc Québécois since 1992 has frequently taken Quebec partly or almost entirely out of the equation. I think it's settled into being partly out of the equation, but it's still not completely part of the equation. The second thing is that the cities have become so big in Canada as a proportion of the population. Canada used to be an agricultural country, a rural country with a few cities. And the cities were small and they were tightly defined. Canada now has very large cities. And if you look at them from a light map, or if you look at them from the metric of a 2-hour commute, which is about what anybody can handle, what you see are very large urban blobs in the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island, in the Greater Golden Horseshoe area, really from Niagara Falls all the way to Oshawa, up to Lake Simcoe, out to Kitchener, arguably even out to London. A pretty sizable conurbation around Ottawa, Gatineau, and then a pretty sizable sprawl in the island of Montreal and its environs on both the North and South Shore, and something not far behind in Calgary, Red Deer, Edmonton. That common experience, those places have similar voting patterns that actually probably are more like each other than the traditional divides of language or region. Downtown Calgary votes more like downtown Montreal than it votes like Crowfoot or Yellowhead, okay? The Liberals have been the big beneficiaries of the shift in what a geographer would call the spatial fix of Canadian politics, from being one about region, which often had religious or linguistic overtones to it, to being one about urban density. And now the battlegrounds in Canadian politics are the suburbs and the far suburbs. So when the Liberals are doing badly, they're pushed back into their urban core. When the Liberals are doing better, they're able to fight with the Tories for the older suburbs that were built after the Second World War. And then when the Liberals are doing really well, they're winning in very new suburban areas like Abbotsford in British Columbia, or Milton in Toronto, or Uxbridge, or in the farther reaches of the North Shore, almost over to Trois-Rivières, east of Montreal, okay? So, and they're competing successfully when they're doing really well as the urban party. They're winning seats in Calgary, for heaven's sake, and in Edmonton. That's the changing complexion. And so for Liberals, putting together a coalition now, I think, is less a game of regional pieces, a la Mackenzie King, Wilfrid Laurier, Brian Mulroney, and more a question of playing the politics of urban density that bring together a national majority of urban and suburban dwellers. Yeah, for the conservatives, I think they actually have to beat that back in British Columbia and Ontario and allow the prevalence of their regional strength as classically defined in the prairies to come through. But right now, at their current numbers, they're hard put to do it.
So that's where I was going to take this a little bit, because I think that's a really wise observation on the sort of liberal equation. And for the conservatives, you hear this election is going to be fought in suburbia. It's all about suburban Toronto and suburban Quebec and so on and so on. Erin O'Toole clearly coming into the election behind in the polls, needs a bit of a barnstormer campaign. And in the early days, He's out with his platform first. He's released the entire document. He's not sort of bleeding individual pieces announcement by announcement over the campaign, which is sort of the traditional approach. He looks like he's trying to come in a bit faster and a bit more furious and to try to gain some momentum. Early polls show that maybe there's a little bit of a gap closing, but it's really early and we've only seen one or two. So I think it's really not enough to make a conclusion on. How does that tactic differ from normal campaigns? And is that the one that you kind of recommend if you've got ground to make up?
It's definitely one I recommend if you got ground to make up. If you're in a foot race and you're the guy behind, you don't want to keep doing the foot race. You want to try to turn it into a boxing match. So hurl yourself bodily forward and try to get a scrap going on policy. Good way to do it is to release a platform. Question is, will it work? It may. The one problem though is that it really undercuts what's been a decent card for all the opposition parties, which is complaining about the timing of the election as sort of crass an opportunist. You can't simultaneously claim that the election's an irrelevant indulgence by an incumbent prime minister who's power-seeking and self-aggrandizing and introduce a serious policy debate. You kind of have to pick a lane. And I think the Conservatives have made a choice that says we will get more opportunity by picking the lane of actually contending the election in its substantive form than continuing to whine about its timing, even though that, we were getting some resonance out of the timing. People are a little annoyed about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And it'll be interesting to see areas where, for example, on childcare, they've, like you mentioned previously, they put forward a different idea than the $10 a day childcare, and they used something that was successful for conservative governments in the past. It's very similar, if not identical, to what Ontario and the campaign I was a part of with Premier Ford ran on. So it'll be interesting to see now that they've started this policy scrap, if they're actually ready for the policy fight. Because it's one thing to put the platform out and say, look, we have a plan and we know what we're going to do in government. It's another to be able to defend that for the entirety of the campaign, have experts pick that apart, have your political opponents start to pick that apart. And that happens when you release the full document all at once early on.
Yeah. And on the childcare issue, I saw this play in 2006, and it was successful for Harper against my candidate, Prime Minister Martin. But I think this time there's an easy argument available to Liberals, which is to say this kind of proposal from Mr. O'Toole is exactly how the Conservatives derailed the last serious attempt to build a national childcare program, was by saying, oh, why don't we give the money to parents? Did we get more childcare? No. Did we get a national program? No. Did we get uptake of the tax credit? No. Did anything happen? No. So, folks, this is up there with let's study climate some more. This is one of those conservative Trojan horse offerings that amount to, how about we just don't do it? Do you want to lose another 10 years on this? I think that argument's available to Liberals in a way that it wasn't in 2006, because frankly, the Liberals hadn't moved much on childcare. Certainly under Prime Minister Chrétien, they hadn't, and Martin had barely gotten it going. As an interprovincial diplomatic initiative, Trudeau's much further down the pike. He's got deals with all of the major provinces, including Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, I think damn near everybody. And so I don't think it's the same conditions in which the play is being executed as last time. But it's a fascinating strategic fight. It really is.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think that's where the Liberals really showed their mettle, was going out and getting those deals before the election call, and obviously being the ones who were controlling the date of the call. They had a little bit of runway themselves to work with, and
I can tell you, the 2004-2006 Martin government had no control over its timing, because we were at the mercy of a minority parliament and living from day to day. It was a Bon Jovi song. It was not a controlled exercise. It was awesome. We did many great things, but smooth timing was not one of them.
I was going to say Aaron O'Toole has sort of 5 planks that he's running on, and one of them was about domestic vaccine procurement and that sort of thing. And you saw the Liberal government come out a few days before the election call and sign an agreement to have that exact thing done here, which really makes it difficult to campaign on that as a wedge, right? So a smart set of strategic plays going into the election to keep the opponents further behind.
Yeah. I also believe, Mitch, not to deviate too much, but I think the vaccine wedge is a very dangerous thing for pointed at O'Toole. I really agree with the commentators who have said from day one, this is a serious vulnerability. Conservatives I've talked to have said it's a serious vulnerability. I mean, it's a myth that COVID lost Trump the 2020 election, but there was a degree of a nationwide rallying point amongst people who wanted to fight COVID in a science-based way. There was a dynamic that said this whole campaign is on the wrong side of this issue. And look at these anti-vaxxers, super spreaders, deniers, no maskers, rugged individuals who say no one's going to tell me how to handle my body when in fact, it's about public health. I think that is a serious vulnerability for O'Toole. I think he knows it. That's why he's tried to straddle it with pulling out defensive tactics, like saying, oh, people should be allowed to choose, and oh, let's not politicize it. I think it is political. And I think it's going to hurt the Conservative campaign probably. I think that's also one of the reasons they issued their platform when they did, was to change the subject.
Yeah, and so this gets me to an interesting question, because it's also worth noting that Jagmeet Singh and the NDP have put out their platform. I think they were a bit more coy in saying that they will have some more announcements during the campaign, and it's not all there, but the document is still over 100 pages, I think. So it's a pretty cohesive platform at the same time that apparently it's not. But during an election, there's always this line that campaigns matter, that things happen. Right. Most recently, we can think to the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015 and some of the images that happened that sort of derailed some of the Harper campaign and the messaging that they were moving for. We have rising case counts across the country with the Delta variant. So the vaccine conversation is obviously topical. We've even seen in the very first few days of the campaign, this crisis in Afghanistan with the Taliban taking back over control and trying to get refugees out of that country. Campaigns happen, events happen. How big of a risk is it for the 3 parties, given that 2 of them have already released their platforms and will have a tougher time responding to those events live? And one of them is in a front runner position, where I would imagine is hoping that these events don't occur. I mean, it's got to be one of the unpredictable things about this election, that really anything can happen. And it's a bit of a scary place if you're the different strategists in the party trying to think through what those events might look like.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about Canadian elections is that they tend to be about subjects that are within Canada's span of control. Canada's not the world's global policeman, the United States is. And so anything that happens in a campaign in America affects anything that happens in the world that's of substance and scale affects an American campaign. Much less so in Canada, because Canadian voters understand so much of what happens in the wide world, from the economy to the environment to a degree, to certainly issues of international peace and security, is outside the span of control pretty materially of Canadian governments. So there's a bit of a buy on that one. On the other hand, you can get caught flat-footed. I think the biggest risk about responding to events is that you appear to be tone deaf sometimes if you get it wrong. And it can really hurt you. Suddenly people can all sorts of folks all across the country, and this is more the case than ever in the age of social media, can just say, that's just inappropriate. That's not cool by the pool. You're not comporting yourselves like a government and like a good group of people should. And that can really hurt if you get it wrong. That's why I thought it was so important that the Prime Minister began his election call announcement in front of Rideau Hall by demonstrating concern about events in Afghanistan. It would have been tone deaf not to. And I think that's the most important piece. For platform drafters, and I've drafted a couple of these things at the national level and some at the provincial and municipal level, you worry a little bit about getting locked in by an early release, but usually platform language is broad enough and drafted with enough protect room in it, like protection measures, to enable some ability to respond to events as they unfold. The people who draft these things, and Mitch, you've been one of them, and I've been one of them. That's a lot of what they do, is try to keep the words flowing and the options open at the same time. Not to be crass about it, you just have to write it that way. And so I can't think of a situation when an early platform release is awkwardly locked in a party from responding to an event that happened out there. I don't know if you've got one in mind, but I think that's pretty manageable. What's more of a concern for the opposition parties than anything else in all of this is ticking clock. The campaign has been organized in a way, the legendary and always incredibly insightful Chantal Hébert said this on the election afternoon coverage on Sunday. She said, I really expect the campaigns to tread water essentially until the debates happen on the 8th and 9th after Labor Day. To some degree, the platform issuance of the Conservatives and the New Democrats in part has confounded Hébert's prediction, but I don't think in a material way. I don't think Canadians woke up this morning saying, I am getting a hold of that Aaron O'Toole platform because I want to know the details on this childcare announcement. I think the truth is it's going to be a bit of a watery, phony war kind of campaign period until the debates. And I think that's deliberately engineered. I think the pre-campaign went really well for the Liberals. The Conservatives started off on their back foot. The NDP have got something going if they can translate. And I don't think there's going to be a lot of sort of wild slugs or great big public breakout plays happening in the public facing part of the campaign that we see on television or read about in the newspaper before the debates in that week after Labor Day.
Yes. So as we get to the last couple of questions of the podcast, one of them actually that I had sort of written before that I wanted to ask you about was the debate. So I'm glad you brought that up. I pulled the viewership from the 2019 debate, which all things considered didn't really move the polls. I don't think was one of the most historic debates of all time. I don't think it was up there with the Brian Mulroney, you had an option, sir, or anything like that. But still, 9.7 million Canadians tuned in at some point to the English debate on television, and they had an average audience of 3.9 million Canadians at any given time. So it's still a way of reaching a phenomenal amount of people. Perhaps a lot of them already have their minds made up, but you're reaching a phenomenal amount of people at once. Is the debate as pivotal as it used to be, or has it sort of lost some appeal despite those viewership numbers in the importance in a campaign? So I'm curious how you might see that playing out in this election.
I think debates can still be absolutely pivotal. I really do. Despite the fact that, they're now nested in a context of social media that can, serve as a weight stabilizer on any dynamic pro or con that happens. They're still really important. I'll give you two quick examples. In 2015, Trudeau comes out to the foreign policy debate, the one put on by the Monk debates, and just gives a bravura performance. And it came at a point when his momentum was building. It had started to show up in the polling. It was clear that he had momentum and the NDP didn't, and that he was the challenger. And he came out and he basically, in a live audience performance, totally took the hall and totally took the television audience. And he didn't land any knockout blows against the prime minister, but he put Mulcair into the shade. You couldn't find Mulcair in the debate. And Harper looked like he was sort of didn't know what to make of this awesome performer who he had on his hands all of a sudden. So Harper just sort of chuckled and tried to be kind of fatherly about it. And in fact, looked even more kind of out of touch as contrasted with this dynamic young bolt of energy, Justin Trudeau at the age of 44. It was amazing. And the momentum that happened out of that event in downtown Toronto with all the media people and all the campaign people and all the chattering classes in the hall, that dynamic shift was noticeable. Another one of a deflating type was in the 2018 Ontario election campaign. Andrea Horwath went in the second debate on her way to being premier. She had eclipsed the Liberals. The Liberals were in deep trouble and heading down to a historically bad result. Most people had written off Kathleen Wynne as a potential premier. The other thing is Horwath kind of mailed it in. She did not produce the kind of performance that says, I'm about to be premier and this is going to be really great for everybody. In fact, Ford did a better job of doing that night. And I think you could feel the NDP upward trajectory kind of go flat after that. It was almost as though a decision was made in the karmic universe that it would be fine for the NDP to finish second. And that is indeed what happened. And you're nodding your head, Mitch, because you were probably in the room in that debate. I was watching it on TV in a crowded bar of desperate Liberals. And I can tell you, we all certainly felt, well, there goes the NDP. I mean, you know, and we're proud of our candidate as always, but something just shifted. So I think debates still really matter. Did you feel that way on debate night vis-a-vis Horwath?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know if I would as agree with the line that she was on her way to be premier, but that might just be because I was sitting in the war room, so it's hard to feel that way. But
you knew you were going to win no matter what.
Yeah, but they undoubtedly had serious momentum, right? And I remember the campaign did two things. The first was shifted to highlighting the entire team that was surrounding Ford in terms of the other people like Carolyn Mulrooney and Rod Phillips and those types of people, which really did help, especially when contrasted to the NDP. But you're right, in the debate, there were so many times where now Premier Ford was able to say, Kathleen Wynne and Andrea Horwath have the same position on this. They're saying the same thing. They both want to tell you how to do childcare. They both want to raise your taxes. And so the visceral dislike that existed for the Liberals at the time provincially, it just sort of washed over to the NDP. And it was, well, I can't have more of the same, or I can't have an even further version of the same. And so I think you're right that there was an effective portrayal there. I would actually agree with you even more so on the Trudeau debate that you were mentioning in 2015, because you got to remember that was the sort of infamous "he's just not ready" tagline that the Conservatives were putting out there. And, you know, nice hair in the commercials, but not ready to be prime minister. All of a sudden he goes into a debate and has a prime ministerial like performance, and you go, maybe he is ready, right? And so I think you were right that he had a great performance there, but even more so, it directly countered the government's the Conservative government's positioning at the time. And so interesting, if O'Toole, I noticed the table of contents in his platform, each single line in the table of contents starts with a detailed plan on. And so perhaps that's what he's trying to go for, is that he actually does have a detailed plan, and he's not just touting populism across the country or speaking in high broad strokes. So I think you're right on the debate. I think it's an interesting factor. The last question I'll ask you is the other major factor that happens in elections. And if we want to draw a parallel to the 2018 war room in Ontario, one that we kept hearing going around when the NDP was surging momentum was, our voters turn out, right? They show up more often. They're older. They're more invigorated. This younger demographic that the NDP might have a hold of, they don't typically vote. Or they don't vote in such strong numbers. And so we're kind of, I'm interested in your thoughts on this at the federal level, because we've seen some pretty good turnout numbers over the last few years, Trudeau probably being a big part of that. Do you expect turnout to be a high number this time? Do you expect it to be a little bit lower? We now have absentee ballots, potentially, people being able to do mail-ins and those sorts of things because of the pandemic. And we saw in the 2020 presidential election, there was quite a high turnout number for a variety of reasons. So does some of that spill over? Curious of your thoughts. I know it's a very early stage, but curious your thoughts of how eager Canadians may or may not be to actually cast a ballot in this election. And if that's something that strategists and parties need to be thinking about this early on.
Strategists do think about turnout a lot, more and more as the years have gone by. Because the reason why they think about it more is because of the demographic shift, is the unusual phenomenon of the baby boom moves into retirement, and its elder members move on past this mortal coil, Mitch, as they pass away, as they must, as we all must. The notable propensity of older voters to vote Conservative starts to get leavened. So that turnout question of sort of the composition of the electorate and who votes, and we know that seniors like voting. It's part of their established behavior. It's like going to church. They do these kinds of things. Young people, not so much, like going to church. So what made those questions so critical in 2015 was there was kind of a balance. Older baby boomers and pre-baby boomers who are conservative and high turnout voters suddenly got balanced, which had been a prohibitive advantage for Harper's campaigns, suddenly got balanced by a youth quake and an FNMI quake, where First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous people actually turned out and voted in big numbers for Trudeau, along with lots of young people, who we call millennials now, okay? Gen Z will just begin to vote in this election campaign, probably not in really big numbers, not because they aren't motivated, just because they don't have big numbers yet. We're going to have an experiment here this time, for the first time in the Canadian federal election, in Gen Z voting behavior as they come on stream. But I think it's fair to say that the millennials are now a very big block. They do vote. They've picked up the habit. The other thing is there are fewer seniors. There are fewer older people around of that noticeable bump called the baby boom. And COVID and the concern about COVID may have a depressing effect, unfortunately, amongst older voter turnout. One good thing, though, is in this country, everybody makes it easy to vote. All of the political actors in Elections Canada having national elections as opposed to a collection of manipulable local elections like they have in the States. I mean, in the US, the right to vote, the ability to vote, is a terrible political battleground. In Canada, it is handled by a nonpartisan, technocratic, bureaucratic function that is about politics, and that's very Canadian, and that's a very good way to do it. So we know that people who want to vote are not going to have much trouble voting, and that's a great blessing of life in this fair dominion.
So for the very last question, I won't ask you who's going to win, because I think that that's unfair to you and a disservice to us. But I will ask you, given that you wrote about pivotal elections time and time again, is this going to go down? Is 2021's election going to go down as a pivotal election in Canada's history, or is it just going to kind of be a blip on the radar we look back on and say, yep, forgot about that one?
It won't go down as pivotal as a campaign fight unless there's an upset. Okay. It may well go down as policy pivotal, like 1945. The Prime Minister's point is very real. The country is embarking on a different course. And I have to say this, the climate crisis is so supervening. It simply cannot be underestimated how large this is as a challenge and a dynamic. Weather has been the top story on every newscast practically for 3 years now. Okay, talk to the insurance industry, talk to people in civil safety and public safety, talk to first responders, talk to homeowners. That's just the front end of it. Then you can start talking to biologists, and you can start talking to oceanographers. There is nothing good happening in terms of the ability of this planet to sustain our way of life. That is actually what's underlying here. And I hope this campaign will have some focus on that, because a massive shift is underway and we're not adapting as quickly as we need to.
Yeah, it is an interesting point to think about where the parties have reached sort of cohesiveness, right? So the Conservatives have finally endorsed a form of carbon pricing, and no, it's not exactly.
Leader has.
Yeah,
your leader has, Mitch, and not sure the Conservatives have.
Fair point. But it will be interesting to look back at some of these policy positions, be it childcare, be it climate change, or others, and say, did we reach a uniform consensus or not? And was this the decision in which we picked a lane, to be honest, right? So I think that's something to watch out for throughout the rest of the campaign. And for people who are listening or watching the podcast, we're going to have more episodes. We're going to dive into some different things, be them less policy conversations, more about communications or regional stuff. But John, really appreciate you coming on the show and kicking off this little mini series on the federal election. And given that you might be one of my bosses here, you probably have an invite back at some time.
I'd love to come back. And you know what? It's always a great campaign, because every campaign is great because Canadians get to vote. So please get out and vote. Do it early. Don't do it often. That's against the law and out of compliance. But I hope people make the most of the democratic moment. It's something that we fought and died for over the centuries, and we need to treasure it and make it inclusive for everyone.
Oh, a great message to end on. So thanks again.
Thanks, Mitch.
Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the StrategyCorp Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. Views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of StrategyCorp. All rights to this episode are reserved, and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of StrategyCorp. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material, or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time, I'm Mitch Davidson.